All right. Well, today I am here with Ian Weiss again, and Weiss. Today I'm here with Ian Weiss again, and
You did that last time too.
I know the last time was half on purpose. Actually, this time it was totally just like. Okay. Well, today we're going to be talking about modern music. Now, for me, modern music really kind of basically it begins at like the turn of the 20th century. Um, there's some late romantic guys that kind of dip into this modernist kind of thing. But I sort of I really see like Wagner as kind of the end of the romantic era. Like what he thought that he was doing was this new thing, but really he was like the end of an older tradition. And I see like everyone that kind of comes after Wagner until about 1905, 1910. Those guys are kind of like these bridge figures into this modernist world. Um, so I don't know. What are your thoughts on kind of this late romantic, early modernist blur?
Well, I I think along the same lines, although there's a very big distinction that I find that has to be made with all this. Wagner, I would say, is the end of tonality. As I'm sure a couple people understand that from the infamous Tristan chord, we suddenly have the idea of a strong centric pitch being dismissed, even though it's still a piece of tonal music necessarily. It's still at the
Sure.
end of Tristan it resolves to A.
Right. But it's like, after what, like 5 hours or something, you finally get a tonic chord,
Yeah, along those lines, it's welcome to Wagner, everybody.
right? That's one of the things like the ring cycle, it's like you don't get a tonic chord until like 4 days into it.
Yeah, 14 hours of opera, right? And then you finally get a tonic chord.
Right, right, right.
But that's now we've stretched tonality to the extremes, and suddenly we have nowhere to go.
Hmm.
Like, what else is there to do? So I can see what you mean with the idea of bridge figures. You have people like Mahler, who started pushing the envelope quite a lot more. He started adopting some of the principles that we'll talk about in a little bit. You have Debussy, who, starts, he hated theory. Debussy
Yeah.
did not like theory at all. So he did whatever he wanted to. And that
Whatever
result,
sounded good.
yeah, whatever sounded good, pentatonic stuff, gamelan inspired stuff, Asian inspired stuff.
Right.
And it created a personal harmonic language and then kind of led to the imitators in the French style. But then you have the serialists, the ones who actually are trying to take after the Brahms side of things and preserve German music. That's sort of the irony behind what we call modernity. It was an attempt to preserve high German tradition by introducing something that could not be replicated necessarily as easily.
Yeah, yeah, that is true. That's like in a way, it's like all of these, like the expressionist movement that was created by Schoenberg was a really conservative movement in a way, because they were trying to keep these sort of like classical ideas. The idea of form and theme was really important to the expressionists.
Yes, but was also then a distinctly German language.
Right, right. Yeah, the sort of it always seems that the German composers, like even all the way back to Bach, they they followed the rules. That was like the thing about the German style, was that it was there was an order to it, and it unfolded in a certain way, and you sort of knew how to do the equation. And that's kind of how it's always sort of been with the German composers, especially in like the classical era. Form took on a whole new meaning, and then like Beethoven kind of ruins that for everybody, and then everyone sort of says like, oh, well, Beethoven did it, why can't I? And then they just kind of keep pushing the rules, right, and
So
fudging
on
them
and
a little
so
bit.
forth, and so on and so forth. Then, with some simplifications in there, we end up with Brahms and Wagner.
Right, right. Which I talk about that in a different lecture with my class. But then post Wagner, You know, there's so many people that are like, well, what do we do next? You know, it's like you said, we have a 14-hour opera. Like, where
14-hour
do we
opera
go?
comprised of four operas that can only be done once in the world at any time because it's so demanding.
Right, right. And for an artist, it's like, what do you do after that? You know, what's the next step?
Yeah,
You
the
know,
next step at that point is, well, if we've already hit the end of the tool set that we have so far, we got to start doing our own thing.
right. You know, and another sort of talk that I had, we kind of discussed this idea with the romantic composers, and it was kind of this way a little bit in the classical era too, but mostly this starts in the romantic era, as far as I know, of just this idea of like composers kind of want to one up each other, you know, and it's like, I can do this more, I can do more of this, right? Which again, it's like you get to Wagner, and Wagner, like, well, I'm going to write a 14-hour opera, and we're only going to resolve at the end of it, right? And then after that, all of these composers are like, well, how do we do more than that? You know? And it's almost like certain composers start to just break away from that completely. And they're like, well, the only way that we can do something different is by doing anything else, right? Like the rules essentially no longer matter. And
Well, it's not so
this,
much that the rules no longer matter, it's that the rules that we've used up to this point have reached their natural conclusion.
well, yeah, right, right. Um,
Those rules still exist. Like I know you would talk about this later with your class, but
sure.
Stravinsky returns to those rules
Of course, of
in
course.
neoclassicism. But we have suddenly a breaking point of, as you said, well, what do we do now? We've hit the capacity for these rules that we know so far.
Right,
That's
right.
when dissonance starts becoming people's best friend.
Exactly. Which, you know, one of the things that I find really interesting is that Debussy's contemporaries, they felt that his music was highly dissonant, you know, but to our ears, it's it sounds so pleasing, you know.
Yeah, it's very lush.
Yeah, right.
Debussy and Ravel alike.
Exactly. Yeah, both of them. They it's yeah. Lush is a good word for it. You know, it's that impressionist style. You know, it's really like glassy in a way, and there's just a lot of like to me it's always been more uh like a stained glass window or something, or like not that's a bad word for it, like
It
just
probably,
something that's real fragile, you know. Like impressionist music reminds me of something that's really fragile, and it
would you
could
say
just
maybe
like
like a wine glass?
maybe a wine glass. Yeah, just the impressionist style in general, it always seemed really fragile, you know, that like anything could just shatter it, you know.
Yeah, and that also has a lot to do with their orchestrational style, but that also is the fact that you have a lack of a tonic center. I mean, actually, Debussy is atonal. If you want to
Right,
go by the purest definition of atonal, Debussy doesn't have a 5/1 motion,
right.
really.
There's nothing tonal about his music. It
There's no
might be
progression of, there's no strong progression that follows the rules.
exactly right. See, I feel like Debussy was more interested in like the colors that he was getting. You know, with Debussy, he's one of the first people, or the first examples, at least in that I see historically, that is starting to experiment less with like the rules of it. You know, how does the tonality work, and more so like what colors can I get out of this ensemble? What colors can I get out of this instrument? Whereas
Yeah, and
like
I say that ends up defining France for at least
right,
50 years or so
right. And you know,
after.
that really is like a French idea in a way, or at least that's what it seems to be historically, because like, you know, Berlioz was a few years, a couple decades before Debussy. And
He was very much of the same idea. He wanted to create the sense of programmatic music, telling the story with the fantastique.
right, right.
Well,
And the thing about his orchestration is that it's real colorful, you know, and you can kind of see in Debussy's music that, I'm sorry, in Berlioz's music, that he's starting to experiment with like the colors of the ensemble more so than like the actual pitch material. And I think that carries on into the sort of French tradition.
yeah, which is where the fragility comes in, because as I said, the first thing that comes to mind when thinking about French music of that idea, why it's so fragile is the orchestration.
Right, right,
It's
right.
very, very personal stuff. And it's like you have violins outre with 6 parts interlaced within one line.
Right, right, right. And there's kind of so much that just happens with the orchestration, right? The what and for my class, like the orchestration of all this stuff, really sort of meaning like what is playing at what point, like what instrument is playing what parts, what
Yeah,
sounds the orchestra is actually achieving,
yeah.
um,
What combination of instruments are playing one line?
right, right. And famously, Berlioz, the French composer, is one of the first to write an orchestration book, right? Or at least his book becomes one of the most famous ones.
Yes, it is very laced with his own opinion on
Of
things.
course, of course.
I
But
have never seen somebody lambast the cornets that much, and
yeah,
then promptly use them himself. But
right, right. He had very strong feelings about sounds. Very strong feelings about sounds.
he also had
Uh,
very strong feelings about the composers around him.
oh, sure, right. That is very true. So, that kind of brings us into into Debussy. And Debussy mostly wrote for piano. However, Debussy's string quartet is one of my favorite pieces, hands down.
Yeah, it is very nice. Although I actually tend personally, I've heard everybody's heard the Debussy piano music. I tend to like his orchestral music a little more,
Sure.
just because we get the opportunity to really hear his orchestrational chops and what he's
I
trying to do on the piano really for real.
Right, right. Yet again, with the orchestra, there's just so much more colors that he has access to that he utilizes, I think, very, very well. Um, I love that string quartet, man. I can't get enough of it. I was actually listening to it yesterday and just kind of like on repeat, and I got to the end of it and it was like, and then it started over again. And I
Back
was like,
again.
yes. It's funny too, or like just to listen to different groups interpret that piece differently. I the Emerson Quartet has a really good recording of it, but I actually really like the Juilliard. Was it the what are their quartet? The Axiom? Is that it? The Juilliard
Juilliard.
Quartet.
Well, they are just called the Juilliard Quartet.
Okay, there is one recording. I thought they had a name, sort of with an A or something.
No, maybe they've changed their name from what I remember, but I remember it being the Juilliard Quartet.
Right. I mean, they are the Juilliard Quartet, but they have a recording of that piece also from, 2015 or something, 2012. I can't quite remember. That's also it's really good. I think those are some of the two best recordings that I found: the Emerson Quartet and the Juilliard Quartet of that piece. Now, Debussy really is. I mean, there are other French composers of note, but as far as my class is concerned,
There's Ravel, which he
right, Ravel comes a little bit
invention,
after Debussy,
but very much takes up after his
of
ideas.
course. Ravel is a little bit more like refined in a way because I feel like with Ravel there's a little bit more form. He cares more about tonality, right? He has a lot more like cadential motion, 5-1 kind of happening.
Yeah, but it's still not tonal necessarily.
Oh, sure, right. He just has more tonal implications than Debussy does. And while Debussy didn't really care about theory, I feel like Ravel did care about theory.
Again, also Ravel cared extensively about orchestration in theory.
Sure.
Half of what makes Ravel is his orchestrations.
No, I totally agree. But those are really the two French composers that kind of take us into the 20th century. The German composers are a little bit
different.
This is
where it gets interesting.
Yeah, like you get Mahler and Strauss, but then after them, you get this guy, Schoenberg, right? Now, Mahler and Strauss, they are, as far as I can tell, like taking what Wagner had done and then just kind of like stepping over the line, like they care so much about telling a story, right? That the rules of the music are secondary to the story. However, they're a little bit more like classicist in a way than Wagner was. They cared a little bit more about form, for instance.
Well, I think that depends, at least in Strauss, what you're dealing with, because this is the same composer who went from Salome and Electra to Der Rosenkavalier within the span of a couple of years.
Right, right.
So I just I just wanted to temper your comment on Strauss that way,
Sure.
because he is a very contextualized composer. But Mahler, I would say, is definitely more of that line.
Mm.
A lot of what got into the end of Romanticism and this change into modernity was a reaction against something that happened progressively over time in the Romantic period. It started being personal composition, personalized music, what you wanted to write and how you wanted to one up somebody else and how you wanted to do things.
Right.
Now, the danger of that and what led to its end is that that personal compositional angle leads to a lot of self-indulgence.
Yeah, right, right.
So in people like Mahler, you'll get pieces that are extremely self-indulgent.
Yeah, no, that is very true. It's just, it's like, honestly, I find Mahler and Strauss's music just really hard to listen to. Same with Wagner, man. I find it really hard to listen to because it's just, it's like too much, you know? There's 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 just too much happening, and like it's overwhelming in a way. It's I
Yeah,
find it.
it's
Yeah.
overwhelming, and a lot of times it's conceptually massive for the sake of being massive.
Right. Yeah, there was that idea in the romantic era of just like more, right? More, which again it's like composers trying to like one up each other in a way, you know? And again, you get to Wagner and he's writing these like day-long operas, and you know, that becomes the norm, right? Is just this overindulgent, excessive like thing, which you know that sort of I feel like characterizes the whole romantic era in general. It's like everything was overindulgent, everything was excessive, and you know this that sort of mentality carries on a little bit into the 20th century,
Yeah, because you
but
have
like
people like
society, you know.
yeah, yeah. Before we move on, I just want to say you have like
Yeah.
Mahler who does the Symphony of a Thousand, Mahler 8, which is supposed to be 1,000 people on stage, and between
Right.
the orchestra and the choir, people have done that, and it sounds awful.
Oh, I imagine it's like it gets to a point where you can't even control the sound. Like there is to me like there is no way one single conductor can actually control that sound, because like logistically, you know, to have 1,000 people on a stage is like that's a logistical nightmare, you
You're
know?
filling the hall with just the orchestra and choir.
Right, right, and like the, there's nowhere for that sound to go, you know? Like it just it's too much sound for the space.
And
It's
any little and everybody has a little bit of a pitch change in any section, as anybody who plays a lot knows.
right.
So you have, let's say, 100 first violins, and every single one of them
It's just
is
a
slightly
little,
different.
yeah, right, right. So it creates this. I imagine it creates this weird like spectrum effect where it's like the people in front, like as they go farther back, you know, it's like the farther back you get from the front, the more out of tune you're going to be, because like you in the back can't hear the first violinist, so you got to rely on the people up here who are like listening, but they're like listening to you and the first violinist, so it's like it just becomes this chaotic mess and like a
Yeah,
soup of sound.
yeah. Then you have a what? Let's say you have an E flat. Then you have 100 people playing that E flat, and their instruments are all different. One's hotter, one's colder, one's slightly
Yeah,
more in tune, slightly out of tune. That one E flat becomes 3/4 sharp in each direction.
right, right, right. And it's just like instead of being like a single pitch, right, it's like
A
it's actually
chunk.
like a just yeah a ton of pitches all happening at once, and you can't really even distinguish like what the sound is, you know. There's just it's too much, right? It's just way too much.
And that is, of course, I'm using that piece as a microcosm of the romantic period, because I wanted to go back to the point you were making before. society in the 20s starts getting to be too much after
Right.
the First World War. You have a boom in an economy, and you have suddenly people who have tons of money doing whatever the hell they want to do.
Right. Right. As my students are apt to say, I guess today, that is extra. Everything about this time is extra.
I guess
But
I'm I guess I'm a little on the older generation side. I'm not sure exactly what that means, but
yeah, I mean, it means it's excessive. It's overwhelming. It's just overbearing.
at least I'm not calling it bougie. Then I hate that term.
Yeah, right. I feel like bougie has gone a little out of. It's still there. I still hear it sometimes, but it's a little less favorable today, I guess. So like all of that stuff leads into this new era of art in the 20th century.
Yeah, I glossed over a specific point,
Oh,
but
sure.
we have a big change in how art is created
Right.
right at
Right.
this little year known as 1914.
Right. I mean that's a turning point in music, like in art in general. Um, I don't know.
It's a
Why don't you
turn.
just elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yeah, and I bring up the point 1914 because that's a turning point in the entire world. Um, we suddenly have the world's first mechanized conflict of
Right.
nation states in alliances fighting each other for no mere reason than they're fighting each other.
Right. Yeah. Essentially, like this is World War One.
Yeah, we are in World War One. They called it the Great War back then, the war to end all wars, as we know, which is
Right.
a
That's what
very
they thought it
bad
was, at
name.
least. Yeah. Right. Did not live up to its name so well. uh.
But in
So.
the conflict, you have massive atrocities that are reported back home, committed by all sides.
Right.
The world becomes very bleak because we all learn that we're capable of the same level of destruction that we all blame
Yeah.
the other person for.
Right. Everyone finds out a lot about themselves. I feel like after like from World War One, society, like a bunch of people across the world, basically figure out that like you know what, maybe we're all the same like disgusting creatures actually, and we're all capable of doing these like horrific things. And there, like that could be a whole nother like talk just about World War One. But like
But
how
that
that
lead,
affects art is it's really important to understand that like World War One had a huge effect on art because basically like you said it's like we figure out that all like we can like commit the worst atrocities, right? And
and
art.
we learn of these atrocities. It's not just something that happens and then we find out about it later. It's immediate.
Right, exactly. And as a result of all of this, it's like Europe just gets burned down essentially, right? Like World War One burns down Europe, which is they had basically just recovered from all of these social revolutions of the 19th century, and then like, oh
Their
look,
empires, yeah, their empires decide that we're stronger than you are. No, you're not. World
right,
War One.
and then World War One happens, and again, it's so basically like Europe gets destroyed, and all of these artists and composers are like, hey, you know what sucks right now? Life. Why do we need to create art that's is like happy? And so
Yeah,
like they create a bunch of art that's like really indicative of just some bad stuff,
yeah. The world becomes a very different place. Art stops being about representation of just beauty.
right. And
Art
start
becomes a representation of a spectrum of things.
right, right. Because art captures real life essentially. And that's they go back to this sort of like view of like the purpose of art is to kind of like capture the reality around you in a way, uh, and we get all of these completely radical movements in art. In music specifically, we get all of what my teachers called the isms. You get expressionism, started kind of off with Impressionism, right? But then World War One happens, and then you get Expressionism, you get Primitivism, you get sort of serialism,
Atonalism.
atonalism, right? You just get all of these isms. Later on in the 20th century, you get like minimalism, and you get pandiatonicism, right? And all of these things that just it seemed that like the 20th century, they cared so much about categorizing everything. Like everything had to fit into this neat little box, right? And like once it fit into this neat little box, you can do whatever you want with it inside of this neat little box, right? But it's like
but you can't break out of that little box,
right?
If you're painted as a serialist composer, hi, I'm in this box here.
Yeah,
this
right.
is my world.
This is my world, and everything outside of this box is bad, right? Everything outside of this little serialist box is trash. That's like, which is kind of like what a lot of them believed, you know? It's like if you weren't writing this highly dissonant, highly expressionist music, then like, are you even writing music, bro? You know?
And then consequently, the same thing happened on the French side. You have people, I know we're jumping a little ahead, but you had people who were taking you after Stravinsky's pandiatonicism, and they go, hi, this is my box. Everything that I'm going to write is right in this nice little box. And all the serialists are evil people.
Right, right. And so, you know, it's almost like the feud between like programmatic and absolute just becomes this like feud between dissonance and consonance, you know?
Pretty much. Or at least how you approach dissonance and consonance.
Well, yeah, right. You know, so for instance, like Schoenberg.
Except for one guy.
Whoa, which guy?
Charles Ives.
Yeah, right. Well, you know, we can kind of get into the difference between like the European and the American composers. Actually, I would like to talk a little bit about that.
Well, when I proposed that initially, I was talking about like today.
Oh yeah, no, I know. Like, I definitely want to talk about that. So, you know, we really have only talked about European composers basically up to this point, as far as even my class is concerned. But you know, in the late 19th, early 20th century, the Americans start to become more prominent in the artistic world. Now, one of the big factors of European art was the fact that like World War I basically just burns down Europe, right? But for the Americans, this like late 19th century art that was being created was a direct response to basically the Civil War, right? The Civil War happens, and
America burns down in certain
well, yeah, America
areas.
burns down in the Civil War, basically. And so we have that whole Reconstruction era, you know? And like we get composers like Ives and Cowell, and they sort of establish the American tradition of music, which I think is
starting with Ives, yes.
Right. Ives really was the first. Ives really was the first major American composer. You know, you have like Stephen Foster, who was like this sort of 19th century songwriter, right? But
and his stuff
the
is
American,
really good, but it's more popular on that end.
Right. It seems to be like the American composers for a big chunk of America's history were basically just pop musicians, right? They wrote like parlor songs or you know, folk songs basically,
or character pieces for piano, like Louis Moreau Gottschalk was famous for.
Right. It's a contemporary of Liszt, right?
Yeah, except he was also known more as an American traveler. He went to like Puerto Rico and did souvenirs of Puerto Rico.
Right.
Postcards of Puerto Rico, just, you know, things that evoked sort of a Latin American meets Louisiana style.
Right. You know, something that's always been really funny about that to me is that as far as the Europeans were concerned, you know, they get really into this idea of exoticism, and like America was like this highly exotic place, or like the Americas, you know, was just this highly exotic place to these composers. There was one opera, I can't remember the name of it right now, but it was set in like the desert landscape of like Louisiana or something. It's so bizarre. Like it's like this French composer's view of like Louisiana, and it was this like desert landscape when there's like cowboys and stuff, and it's like not what you imagine when you think of Louisiana at all, but that was like their view of it, you know.
Yeah, I mean, well, that's also just not understanding some of the subjects, but that's the double-edged sword of exoticism. But
Yeah,
that's
right,
another talk.
right. Anyway, so the American composers, though, like Ives, I want to dig into Ives a little bit. He was really one of the first of the experimentalists, I think. And when I say that term, I'm like not meaning like, oh, he's experimenting with like harmony or form. It's like no,
No,
he's
he is
experimenting
experimenting.
like experimenting, like what happens when I take two ensembles and have them play different pieces at the same time? Like what does
Yes,
that
that
sound like?
this is one of my areas of expertise, so
Yeah,
this is why
man.
I wanted to bring him up.
By all means, talk about him.
Yeah, so Charles Ives, as some people may or may not know, was born in Danbury, Connecticut. So, not too far from where I am, not
Right.
ridiculous amount of distance away from Texas. If you wanted to come up to this way, you can actually visit his birthplace.
Yeah.
So, one of these rare situations, you can visit an American composer
Right.
where it's from. Anyway, his father was George Ives, was the bandmaster in Danbury, Connecticut, and a very apt experimentalist. So he
Yeah.
learned a lot of what he wanted to do from his father, who would build a quarter tone piano in his family's living room by stacking them on top of each other, tuning wine glasses into quarter tones and having them play by licking their finger doing that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or
Did Ives have perfect pitch?
if he didn't, he certainly developed it because his father would have him sing, let's say, Columbia Gem of the Ocean in B flat while he played it in G.
Yeah. So, in a way, it's like that's really similar to what Bach did to his sons. Like by having them play like fugues in different keys in all of their limbs. And like this hand plays it in G, this hand plays it in A, and your left foot plays it in B, and just kind of like having all of these different things happening at once.
Yeah, which then, of course, manifests later on in his music after he graduates, particularly from Yale.
Right.
Because
That
Yale,
is
he would.
something. So Ives was one of was he the first class to study music in Yale? Because I know he was one of the first. I'm not sure if he was the first class though.
I don't recall him being the first class of people to study at Yale. But
Well,
at the time, it
not
was
not
only
just
men.
Yale, but Yale Music, right? Because like the music program was really new still when Ives was there.
I don't think he was the first class of
Okay,
Yale, but I think he was among the first.
yeah, I do
Um,
know that he goes to Yale really early on and
because he
studies
also
music.
got in for business and took composition lessons anyway.
Ah, okay. I didn't realize that. I know that he went to Yale. I thought he went to Yale for music, but he just studied music at Yale.
He studied music at Yale and he went there for business, which is why he ended up in the insurance business.
Right. That's one thing about Ives. How I always thought was really funny is that he writes this really experimental music, but it's almost like he knew that no one was gonna want to do it. So like he had to do something else to fund all of this crazy stuff that he was doing. So he sold insurance, and that was like his
Not
day
only did he
job.
sell insurance, well, that's a little simplicity. I'm going to make it a little more complex.
Yeah, man.
He formed a company with his friend Julian Myrick that he met after moving out from Yale to New York City called Ives and Myrick, which is, I believe, now part of MetLife.
Hmm.
And because of his business experience, he was able to revolutionize the insurance industry. Revolutionize, not just, I'm selling insurance. Ives changed everything about how it worked.
Nice.
Myrick
Wait.
handled the business side of things, but Charles Ives specifically wrote pamphlets and instructions to his insurance salesmen about how to sell it to people.
Ah, interesting. So he was sort of a salesman more
Yeah,
so than anything else.
because before Ives came around, the insurance industry was that, oh, we assume that people know why they need life insurance. They're going to come to us and they're going to buy life insurance.
Right, right.
Then Ives turned it on its head, saying, well, here's a bunch of information about why you actually need life insurance. And these insurance agents are going to talk to you about why you need it and provide you these pamphlets to tell you this is why you need it. Not just,
Yeah.
oh, you need it because we know you need it.
Man, the power of the written word, right? Like, here, read this pamphlet about why you need this thing. All of these things that make it sound so much more important than what it might actually be.
Yes, but it worked because he
Right.
amassed a massive fortune for himself.
Yes, he did. You know, he amassed such a fortune that he was like he was able to become sort of a benefactor to that other guy I mentioned, Cowell. So, are you familiar with how they met?
I've heard the story, I just don't recall off the top of my head. I remember there being a concert involved with it, but
So basically, like what I heard and the story that I read somewhere along the way was that the very first time they met, um, Ives he was on like a hike or something. He was going camping, something like that. He was in the wilderness. He was like hiking, and he just stumbles upon this kid who like was there, and that kid just turned out to be Henry Cowell, and they sort of start to talk, and they start to hang out, and Ives figures out that this kid is kind of a genius, and like he was entirely self-taught. That was the most interesting thing I think about Cowell is that Cowell never had a formal education until he went to college. Right? He just read. Cowell just liked to read books,
mhm.
and
He taught himself composition, basically.
right. He had taught himself literally everything. He taught himself how to like do arithmetic, how to like. He taught himself philosophy, and he taught himself composition, how to write music. And Ives recognizes this sort of talent in this kid and basically like puts him through school. Like he pays his way through school. And Cal, I believe, went to Stanford. He went to the Stanford music program.
Yeah, that sounds
And
right.
and Ives basically just paid for the whole thing, But
Hmm.
while at Stanford, Cal makes these crazy discoveries about music. He writes that book. What was it? I have a copy of it. What is it called? Um, new something about new music something or
Is that
oh
the
man
book of all the people writing on other people?
no that's the musical lexicon of invective by Slonimsky, I think. uh Hang on, let's see. Cowell book. Henry Cowell. Whoops, not Henry Vowell. Henry Cowell. Book. New musical resources. That's it. New musical resources. Um,
Okay, because I also knew he ended up creating the publication of the music magazine where it published scores as well.
right, right. His first book though was pretty important actually. He wrote it in 1930, right? Just to give a timeline for all this, Ives is sort of like late 19th century, early 20th century. So he's like this American bridge figure, right? But
Although he lived
sort of
until 54, he stopped composing in 27.
right, right. Um, so anyway, Henry Cowell writes this book called the New Musical Resources, and in this book, he talks about all these different ways of thinking about music. He talks about some like American traditions. He talks a little bit about the American tradition of shape singing and how you can use notation to create different ideas of sound and whatnot, which is something that a lot of composers now have taken to heart. Um,
Is
John
that
Corigliano.
talking? Is that talking about shape singing or shape note singing?
Shape note singing, right? He talked a little bit about that, but then how that idea can be utilized in composition. And he also talks about how what's called the harmonic series, right? And how basically inside of one note, every note kind of exists, which is why like
If you have one note, you have actually a spectrum of other notes that combines to create that note's sound.
exactly. Is he the one that calls it chroma? I can't remember, but I know that that's the term now that's widely used.
A lot of people call it chroma, and that goes back to even the Greeks.
Okay. Now, when I say the term chroma, I'm talking about the particular qualities that make a note sound like a note, right? So, in Western music, right, we are basically have a 12 equal pitches, right? 12 pitches. And each of those pitches has a particular sound, right? And we call them particular names. And chroma relates to why that one pitch sounds like that one pitch. It's a lot like why green is the color green,
Yeah.
hence
For
color.
example, yeah. For example, green is a combination of some form of blue and some form of yellow light.
Right.
Reflected back to you.
Now, in terms of color, we only get 3 primary colors, right? But in terms of like pitch, the way that the West has sort of worked it out, it's like we get 12 primary pitches, 12 primary colors in a way. And how high or how low that pitch is, that particular pitch, is sort of also related to how dark or how light that pitch sounds. That's the way that I've been thinking about it lately, at least.
Yeah, it's also like, if you want to get deep into it, if we're going back on the colors idea, there is, let's say we have a pitch B. That B is comprised of the B itself, the F sharp above it, the B above it, the E sharp above, then the E sharp, D sharp above it, the F sharp above that, the A sharp, the A above that, so on and so forth.
Right.
And whatever is happening in that spectrum determines what kind of color that note is.
Right.
So you could have blue, or you could, let's say, have phthalo blue, titanium blue, midnight blue, and something like that.
Navy blue, right. There's all those different types of blue, right? And they all have the quality of blue, but they're different shades of blue. Much like B at the very bottom of the keyboard has the quality of a really low B, right? And then all the other Bs have that same quality, but there's just different shades of that B as you go up, right? They just get brighter as they go up. Now, I don't want to get too much onto this like color aspect, but Cowell is sort of one of the first guys that I know of to really go in depth into that concept. Now, I'm sure that people had been talking about this before, but I feel like Cowell was one of the first ones to really sort of talk about it and why it's significant. And does he present the idea of the under series as well?
Well, that
does that comes later, doesn't it?
The Undertone series, well, that's always been around since Rameau, but it's been sort of dismissed. That's a discussion for another time, I think.
Yeah, right. That honestly, the Undertone series is something that I don't quite know enough about to actually really talk about it. I just know that it's a tool.
If you go back and read Rameau's treatise, yeah, you'll find out that he talks about something called what he calls them the implied fundamental of something like that.
Sure.
And that actually is really the foundation of the Undertone series.
Yeah, it's something I need to go back and look at.
Yeah.
Now, I want to talk a little bit more about Cowell, though, because I find Cowell and Ives actually both to be extremely interesting composers. So we have 2 examples of their music in my class that we listen to. Ives is I always just call it General Putnam's Camp, but you know the actual title of it. What is it?
Putnam's Camp, Reading, Connecticut, from 3 places in New England.
Yes, it's an amazing piece of music, man. And the best way that I can describe it is, what happens when you are standing in the middle of a battlefield and you hear 2 different camps like happening at the same time, right?
Do you actually know that's a programmatic piece of music?
Yeah, right. It's really programmatic. It's highly programmatic because essentially he's trying to outline like 2 camps across a battlefield,
No, actually, have you seen the original score? The score actually prints a story in it.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, so you'd probably have never actually been to Putnam's Camp, but you can go there right now. It's
well, not right now, but
I mean, well, you know what I mean. So General Israel Putnam was if I remember correctly, a Civil War general who had a lot to do with music, and he had a lot of performances that occurred within his company. But his camp in Reading, Connecticut has become sort of a performance ground for like a picnic ground and national site, but also back in the day, it'd be a place for amateur bands to come and perform in little competitions for one another. And so General the Putnam's Camp Running Connecticut piece actually tells a little story of a young boy who comes to Israel Putnam's camp on one of the band days to hear all the bands play games, sing whatever he wanted to do. He goes out into the forest and takes a nap under a tree where he has a vision of the soldiers marching behind Lady Liberty to war. He wakes up and then returns back to the camp for reinvigorated for the spirit of what actually is going on, and has more to do with the meaning behind it.
Right. So, I mean, this is actually a highly patriotic piece of music. It just sounds like something that a lot of people have never heard of before.
Mm-hmm. Because why it's interesting that you use the term patriotic, because there's a lot of patriotic tunes that are quoted within it, like American popular music at the time.
Oh, yeah, right, exactly. Like there's the Yankee Doodle, I think, is in there. There is, was Stars and Stripes in there as well? The Sousa.
Let me go to the Sinclair catalog.
Well, I don't want to get too wrapped up into this right now. But
well, I want to do it for my own sake now.
Fair enough. Well, so while Ian searches for that, these tunes, they were a huge part of American life at this point, right? They were essentially folk songs, right? These sort of like patriotic tunes, or things that we sort of associate today with like patriotism. The reason that they kind of have that connotation is because of like what Ives had sort of done with these, and sort of what these things meant to soldiers at that time. Now I can't remember off the top of my head exactly what is in that piece, but when you go to listen to it, like you will recognize some of those tunes.
I have all the ones that are in here now.
What are they?
For the record, there's this service provided through Yale called the Descriptive Catalog of the Music of Charles Ives, compiled by Jim Sinclair.
Okay.
And the borrowing from the second movement is Arkansas Traveler, The Battle Cry of Freedom, The British Grenadiers, Hail Columbia, Marching Through Georgia, Masses into Cold, Cold Ground, The Star-Spangled Banner, Street Beat, Yankee Doodle, The Liberty Bell March, and Semper Fi March.
Yeah, right. So he quotes the national anthem, he quotes Yankee Doodle,
he quotes
and all of
British
these
Grenadiers.
Right.
Yeah. Throughout the whole thing.
That's really interesting. All of those quotes have to have some significance too. They have to be significant to him in some way.
Oh yeah, the only reason that I would put these quotations in is because he's actually making some form of commentary about the piece, either in which he's writing it into or on the original.
Right. So Ives creates this sense of experimentalism in American art music, basically. And that sort of solidifies the modern position for America, basically, is that America is highly experimentalist. And, that leads into Cowell, right? And Cowell creates like pieces like the Banshee, for instance. And
the Banshee, that's the one you're talking about in class.
Right. The Banshee is the one we're talking about in class. It's kind of a horrifying piece of music if you're not prepared for it. But essentially, it's for a solo piano, right? And all the pianist does is play inside the piano by like raking their fingers across the strings, and it creates this very eerie sound. And Cowell calls it the Banshee. Do you want to illuminate us on what a Banshee is?
Yeah, so a Banshee is based on an Irish folkloric idea of that a haunting woman, essentially ghost, will go around the different highland areas in Scotland and Ireland, shrieking from the high heavens.
Right, and her scream like will kill you. Like that's the thing about the Banshee is like if you like hear the scream or something, like you're gonna die or something like that.
Yeah, some say you die in the process of hearing it. Some say once you hear it, it's almost like the stamp of death upon you.
Right. For any of my students that play like, RPGs or anything, like I'm sure you've encountered a Banshee at some point in a video game. It's usually the scary looking ghost lady that screams at you. That's a banshee. Now
And it's bad
this
news when you see one.
yeah, bad news bears. So
Or if anybody's been to Kings Island, there's a roller coaster called Banshee there too.
ooh, bad news banshee, I guess. Um, so these experimentalist ideas really set the tone for what American composers are going to do for like a while.
Well, there's a
And
second strain of it being Aaron Copland and Leonard Bernstein, that crowd.
right, and they experiment in a different way though. They are like they are trying to create more of like a programmatic. I mean, maybe not programmatic, but like with like Aaron Copland and Bernstein, it's much more like a genuine sound. You know, it's not like just how weird can we get with it. It's like what can we actually do with these sounds?
I tend to think of Copland as trying to develop a sense of Americana.
Yeah, right.
Like
I see that.
what if you were to say the word American Midwest?
Right, right. Particularly with that piece, Fanfare for the Common Man, you know, that sort of like to wide open spaces kind of thing, you know. It honestly, it always reminds me of a rocket ship taking off. Like Fanfare for the Common Man, I just associate that with like the NASA space program for some reason.
Well, there's also another connotation to that piece I'm sure you're aware of.
Uh, enlighten us, or if you don't want
Aaron
to.
Copland was basically a communist.
Sure, right, right. That is something that, yeah, we don't talk about that much in my class, actually. But Aaron Copland was, for all intents and purposes, like a communist sympathizer. You know, didn't he also?
Why,
he would also. They would host like parties in their, like host private parties with like all the artists and stuff in New York, and have all these like bougie philosophical talks about like communism and like. I don't know. It's
yeah,
I think one of the greatest ironies is that like they would actually be like one of the first people to have been killed in a communist revolution.
Yeah, because if you actually look at what was being produced over in the Soviet Union at the time,
Right.
it had to be folk music. It had to be something that the people could understand. And if you did something otherwise,
right,
they killed you.
Well, that was something that I wanted to talk about, but we didn't quite get to it. I know you got to leave here soon.
We can talk about it briefly because
sure, by all means.
This is actually kind of important.
Yeah, I agree. So give us a little bit about Shostakovich then.
Yeah, so Shostakovich, alongside another composer you might have heard of, Prokofiev, were members of the USSR. They lived in Russia, and they were under the thumb of the Soviet Union, particularly Stalin in that time.
Yep.
In those days, you had to conform to the party's wishes in which you composed.
Or else.
Yeah, or else they just carted you off and you were erased from pictures and you never existed.
Yeah, right. Or, I mean, not just you. They might just kill your family. Like, that was one of with Shostakovich, you know, they kept him in line by threatening his family, you know?
Yeah, he always had made sure that he had a briefcase ready to go.
Yeah, right.
Because
just in case.
Yeah, there was, after he premiered an opera known as The Lady Macbeth of Mtsensk.
Yeah.
He was going to be carted off to the Gulag where he was going to be shot.
Right.
The only reason that he didn't have that happen to him was because the guy who was supposed to cart him off was sent away to the Gulag instead. So his manifests of people he was supposed to send to the Gulags went missing.
Wow. Talk about a coincidence, you know?
Yeah, so when you hear the music of Shostakovich, you're going to hear bits and pieces of what's known as Soviet realism, which is what we were talking about before.
Yeah, I think one of the greatest ironies of that term, you know, Soviet realism, right? It's the idea that you had to conform to the Soviet idea of what was real.
Yeah, for example, there's some very, very famous and strange paintings that came out of the Soviet Union, where
Yeah.
you have all the happy farmers tilling the fields with rainbows and sunshine while Stalin is holding the young baby girl up to the sunlight.
Right. In reality, all of those farmers were literally being starved. Like, literally being starved.
And the artist, if he didn't paint that, they would
They would
summarily
shoot you.
paint the canvas with his blood.
Right. Same thing with Shostakovich, right? They would threaten you, kill your family, and then take you off to the gulag. And it's like mid 20th century communism.
Real communism.
Yeah, man. Anyway, so that was kind of the dichotomy really between the East and the West at that point. Like the 20th century really starts to see a lot of change in societal makeup.
So if you want to think about it in broad spectrum, you have the West, which is experimenting with new ideas and new sounds,
Right.
and the Soviet bloc, which is not.
Right. And you know that kind of stems from this sort of post World War II idea of like it's hard to talk about some of these things without sounding conspiratorial, but it's like there's actual documented evidence of this. You know, like for instance, like post World War II, the CIA starts to sort of fund all of these like really avant-garde art programs because they start to realize that like if the people can't sort of like gather around works of art and create a national sense of pride, then they can't be like utilized to have another Nazi party, basically. Because one of the things that like Hitler had done was like he used the traditions of Germany as this sort of like Nazi pride kind of thing. So like the music of Beethoven, the music of Mozart, and particularly Wagner, like get used to create this sort of sense of national pride.
And also Karl Orff thrown in there too.
Right, yeah, right. That's a whole other bag of worms. But all of these composers, they're used to create a point at which all of these people could rally around, right? And it sort of is a way of like just hyping them up, you know, and getting them to really instill that sense of national pride, and that like this was your culture and that this is the best culture, right? And so post World War II, a lot of these governments start to look at the way that art was used, and they take a very different view of what art kind of should be.
Except the Soviets. They sort of actually follow lockstep.
Yep. You know, as much as Hitler and Stalin hated each other, they shared a lot of the same like pathways in a way, you know?
Yeah, where that leads us into today, sort of, where Europe has had such a drastic shift in a reaction against what happened in the late 30s and early 40s.
Right.
Thanks to the Nazi Party and its use of art in that regard to further totalitarian goals. I'm going to steer away from calling it nationalistic goals because it's not quite the same.
Sure. When I say nationalist, I was talking specifically about how Hitler was using like these pieces, these works of art to instill this sense of just national Germanic pride, right?
Yeah, that's also furthering the totalitarian principle.
Right, exactly. Which that is like their true end goal here, was to sort of maintain this totalitarian control over this mass of people, right? And they used certain ideas to achieve that.
So then what happens in Europe is when they start reevaluating their position of, well, people have suddenly used this form of art that we have previously created,
right,
as a means to control the population.
The Romantics, you know, the Romantic composers and artists, they were so enthralled by this idea of national pride, right? They were like, especially the French, man. The French, they were like, we are French, and we want everyone to know that we are French, and we will cut off the heads of anyone who is not French.
Pretty much.
Yeah. Anyway, so I know you got to go here. Any sort of closing thoughts?
I'll leave it with this last comment. So what happens then is that Europe decides that they're going to go 180 and try to reinvent the wheel by making music in totally different manners, or by making shock art, which
Right.
is now why in certain situations you'll have classic operas being presented as, let's say, bloody naked lesbian Nazis.
Yeah, right. It's like how much more shocking can we get? That seems to be like the mantra of the 20th century. Is how much more shocking can we get?
There's much more to discuss, and I'd love to come back and talk about
Yeah,
this again
I
in
know,
more
but you got to
detail.
go, man.
Yeah,
Anyway, thank you, Ian, for hanging out. I'm gonna go ahead and stop the stream now. Goodbye,
cool.
YouTube, and let's stop.